Welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining this webinar to discuss your questions on ETAs, or electronic travel authorizations, to give them their full name. We hope to explain what they are, who they're for, and most importantly, who they actually impact and how. We'll also very briefly touch on two other systems that are coming down the line at some point in the future, which is the EES and the ETAs, and I'll explain how they fit into the picture. We're really happy to be joined again by Chris Ben, the immigration lawyer from Seriphus, leading expert on citizens' rights issues and the EU settlement scheme. He works very closely with the EU delegation, and we're also very delighted to be joined by Cristina Brincianu from the delegation, who will set out briefly what they've been doing in the area of citizens' rights and travel. Hi, Cristina. And thank you very much for all the questions submitted in advance. We'll try and answer, or Chris will try and answer as many of these as possible. You can use the Q&A for further questions, and we'll try, if we get time, to answer some of those as well. And after the webinar, which is being recorded, we'll send out a Q&A document addressing as many questions as possible, and we'll send that out to everyone who's registered. So I'll first take a few minutes to set out a bit of background on the various travel schemes. And after that, Chris will answer questions for up to about an hour, after which our Head of Policy and Advocacy, Kezia Tobin, will speak to you about some exciting opportunities that 3 Million's got coming up around lobbying the government on better proof of digital status. And we'll aim to finish by 7:30 at the very latest, and we'll send out a link to the recording afterwards. So I'd like to start by briefly explaining what an ETA, or electronic travel authorization, is and what it's meant to achieve. So firstly, as you probably already know, ETA is a system introduced by the UK. It's primarily intended for people who come to visit the UK and who don't already have some form of permission to enter the UK through being either British or Irish or having a valid immigration status because you live in the UK. But it needs a little bit of background because the UK has got a list of countries whose citizens need a visa before even being allowed to get on a plane to come to the UK, even if just coming for a visit. This list of countries is available on the UK government's website and currently has around 110 countries on it. And the Home Office can decide to change this list from time to time. And it calls the citizens of these countries visa nationals. And that leaves around 85 countries whose citizens don't need a visa just to come for a visit, and they're called non-visa nationals. But just to be clear, if a non-visa national wants to come to the UK for anything over and above a simple visit, for example, to study or work or live, then they would also need to apply for a visa before setting off on their journey to the UK. But if we're talking about just visiting, then visa nationals need a visa, whereas non-visa nationals don't. So before the ETA scheme was introduced, non-visa nationals didn't need to show an airline, train company or ferry company anything other than their passport when travelling to the UK. And then when they arrived in the UK, many of those non-visa nationals, if they were from the EU or a handful of other countries, were just able to use the e-gates and therefore wouldn't even see a border force officer. So the government has decided to introduce ETAs in order to have more control over who arrives in the UK. And I can read a quote directly from their border strategy document, which says, "We will introduce an electronic travel authorization (ETA) scheme for those passengers visiting the UK or transiting through the UK who do not currently need a visa for short stays or do not have an immigration status prior to traveling. This will allow security checks to be conducted and more informed decisions to be taken at an earlier stage in advance of travel as to whether individuals should be granted permission to travel to the UK or not. The ETA scheme will provide an enhanced ability to screen arrivals and block those deemed to be a threat from entering the UK. So it's all about pushing the border out and, in their words, keeping the bad people from getting on a plane in the first place." And I also just need to note that an ETA is not actually a visa, it's only a permission to travel. So someone who gets an ETA can travel to the UK, and if on arrival they enter through the e-gates, they implicitly get admitted to the UK as a visitor. And if they see a border force officer, they either get admitted as a visitor or they could be refused entry if the officer decides they're not a genuine visitor. So the overall effect of all of this is that all visitors to the UK need to show something extra to their carriers now besides their passport. Visa nationals still need to show their visit visa, just like they did before, and non-visa nationals now need to show they've applied for an ETA. So now that we've set out who the ETA scheme is intended for, i.e. visitors, I now want to move on to who's actually impacted by ETAs, because of course that is everyone, not just visitors, for the very simple reason that an airline will be asking me for an ETA, and if I'm not a visitor, I'll have to prove why I can nevertheless travel to the UK without an ETA, which means I have to prove to the carrier before boarding that I have permission to enter the UK when I get there. And if I'm not a British or an Irish citizen, that means I have to prove that through my digital-only immigration status, or e-visa. So then the question turns to how a carrier can know whether someone's got an e-visa or not, given that it's famously digital only and there isn't any kind of card to prove it. So the way it's supposed to work is that the airline, train or ferry operator uses an automated system called Interactive Advanced Passenger Information, or IAPI. And this means that at the time of checking in, someone's passport number or national identity card number is sent to the UK's Home Office systems, computer systems, and within a fraction of a second, a message is returned saying either OK to board, do not board, or make further checks. And this is why the Home Office tells everyone to link their passport or national ID card to their UKVI account, so that this IAPI system can look up that document number and return a message saying it's okay for you to travel to the UK. If you try and check in online, therefore, you might be told that you can't and that you will have to. I'm a bit worried that I've frozen because everyone else is frozen. So that, can you see me? Was I lost for a bit or
No,
not?
I can see you.
Okay, sorry. Okay. So yeah, so if you try and check in online, you might be told that you can't and that you have to go and see a member of staff at a check-in desk. And that staff member will then scan your passport or ID card, and that scanning should use the same IAPI system. And if they also don't get an OK to board message, that's where it will then get more complicated. And this can happen if, for example, an airline isn't using the IAPI system, or someone hasn't linked their new passport or ID card to their UKVI account, or we suspect someone had a refused EU settlement scheme application in the past, even though they then went on to get status later. Or if there's an error on someone's e-visa caused by problems within the Home Office databases. So what does the carrier do then? They've officially got some options. They can call a 24/7 helpline called the Carrier Support Hub. This team is run by the UK's Home Office, and they should be able to look into someone's immigration status in more detail and tell the carrier that a person can board, even if their latest passport or ID card isn't successfully linked to their UKVI account. The carrier can also ask the passenger for a share code and go to the government's website, which allows someone to check whether someone's share code along with their date of birth confirms that person's permission to enter the UK. Or for commercial reasons, they are actually able to say that they refuse to let the person board, claiming that this person has got inadequate travel documentation, something that we might take issue with, but that's what the carrier might say. So as you can imagine, there's a problem with all of these options. We're seeing in practice that some check-in staff don't seem willing to call the carrier support hub, or maybe aren't aware of it. Many carriers are actively refusing to access a UK government website to go and look at someone's share code, or they say they can't even do that even if they wanted to, because their check-in computers run dedicated software which don't allow the staff to just go to a browser window. And so instead, we're finding that some carriers are asking people to log in to view and prove in front of them so that they can check you're really accessing the system in real time. This is, of course, really problematic if the passenger doesn't have access to the internet while abroad, or can't access their Wi-Fi, or doesn't have a smartphone. Someone who's digitally excluded could have got help from a relative to print out a share code before travelling, exactly as instructed by the Home Office, but then face a demand to log in to view and prove on the spot, which they might struggle with. Other carriers have been known to accept a screenshot or a printout of view and prove, or the original grant letter. While that's kind of nice for the passenger when that happens, no one should actually rely on that, because a screenshot or letter can easily be faked, so it probably won't be long before carriers start refusing to accept such proof. And the biggest problem of all, how can someone with a broken e-visa, or someone who had a technical reason that they couldn't attach their document, even create a share code or access view and prove? Sorry, ignore that bit about not being able to link. I just mean someone who's got a broken e-visa who just can't access view and prove. Because over the years, the 3 million has raised numerous technical problems with digital status to the Home Office, including famously where someone will log in and see someone else's photograph, for example, or seeing a wrong expiry date or the wrong type of status, or they get an error message just trying to log in. So finally, a quick mention about dual nationals. Many of you have asked questions about the impact of the ETA scheme on dual nationals, especially those who are British and European, and we'll be covering this in detail when Chris comes to answer questions in a minute. Before we come to those questions, I just want to also briefly explain two other schemes, the EES and the ETAs. These are not operational yet, but they're coming down the line. So firstly, the EES is the EU's entry and exit system. This was supposed to have gone operational already, but it's been delayed several times, and it's currently expected to go live in October this year, 2025. And this system is intended for all non-EU visitors to the Schengen area of the EU, to count them in and out, and to check that they're not overstaying their maximum allowed time of 90 days in any 180-day period. It's designed to replace the stamping in and out of passports that happens at the moment, which is currently the only way that EU border guards can try and work out manually how long people have been in the Schengen area. So the EES isn't related to visas or pre-travel authorization. It's just replacing the stamping. It will apply to all visitors to the EU of any nationality except EU nationals, and it will therefore apply to British citizens as well. Chris may touch on this in a bit as one of the questions touches on it. Secondly, ETIAS is another system that will be brought in also by the EU. It stands for European Travel Information and Authorization System, and it's the exact mirror image of the UK's ETA scheme. So it's about that pre-authorization to travel. It's currently scheduled to go live towards the end of next year, 2026. At that point, things will become a little bit more tricky for dual nationals who have both British and EU nationality, as they'll have to demonstrate that they're exempt from the ETA requirement when travelling to the UK, and that they're exempt from the ETIAS requirement when travelling to the EU. And proving that exemption is through showing a British passport one way and showing an EU passport the other way. And again, Chris will cover this in when answering some of the questions. But before I wrap up and then hand over to Chris, I also just wanted to give the floor to Christina from the EU delegation to say a little bit more about the immense amount of work that the delegation have been doing on behalf of citizens, particularly when it comes to travel rights. Christina, over to you.
Hi, Monique. Hi, everyone. Thank you to the 3 million, first of all, for inviting me to this seminar. I hope you can hear me all right. And I'm just so glad to see so many citizens, so many EU citizens interested in these topics and joining us tonight. There is lots of added value that us as the delegation and as organizers and as people working in this area can draw from the questions that you are sending us and from the cases or the information that you have come across in your interaction with the immigration system. I would just say that the EU delegation to the UK, we were established after Brexit. So we are a de facto embassy here in the UK representing the EU's interest. And our delegation has a unique section which deals with citizens' rights. That means that we look after the citizens' agreements monitoring, and we collaborate with the Home Office primarily, with our colleagues in Brussels, and with structures like the Independent Monitoring Authority that Monique has mentioned earlier, in terms of getting the information that we hear from the ground from citizens, where there are problems and where there are specific issues that need to be addressed. In terms of what the delegation is doing, first of all, when it comes to travel between the EU and the UK, this is a series of issues and the topic that we are keeping at the top of our agenda and at the top of our engagements with all of our stakeholders. So in every meeting that we have with the Home Office, and we meet with them, for example, every few weeks to check in and to understand a little bit better where the policy is going to and what are the issues. We bring to the table the issue of traveling by EU nationals, especially the EU nationals who are protected by the withdrawal agreement and that have status, either pre-settled or settled status, and the sort of information that we hear from organizations like the 3 million when it comes to travel. So we have been engaging for the past few months, and even before that, when ETA was just a policy proposal and it was not yet implemented, we were engaging with these institutions, and we have stepped up communication since the ETA has come into force on the 2nd of April to basically sensibilize, to raise awareness of the requirement for EU citizens who are not resident in the UK, who do not have a EU settlement scheme status, that they need an ETA now to travel. And I can pop either in the Q&A or in the chat an example of such communication that we are posting all over our social media. We have also amplified the engagement that we have with civil society organizations like the 3 million that support EU citizens, and we have regular briefings with our member states. Here in the UK, all the EU member states are represented, and they have the primary consular protection responsibility when it comes to any issues that EU citizens face, either as residents in the UK or when they're traveling to the UK and they have any sort of problems at the border, or they need any sort of clarifications in terms of their entry rights, so to speak, that they cannot find online already. In terms of other information and other engagements that we are amplifying and that we are carrying on for a really long time, is the fact that we are ensuring that communication from the Home Office as well is clear, and we are trying very, very hard to make all of the information that is available on gov.uk more visible, and have this information also relayed by our consulates and by our member states to provide it to citizens, and especially if you renew your travel documents, because as Monique said, if you renew your travel document, you should go to your UKVI account, the account where your pre-settled or settled status lies, and update that information so that the Home Office and carriers know when you are traveling. We are also engaging quite extensively with the carriers themselves. So we have been conducting a series of discussions with particular airlines that are flying here to the UK from EU destinations. This would be your EasyJet, Ryanair, Wizz Airs, to ensure that the information they have for their ground stuff and that they have in their databases is accurate and it's representative of what the Home Office has already told the public and has already told the carriers in their own engagements. So we would talk with these airlines to understand if they have faced issues, if they have questions. We would bring to them any cases that have been gathered through Monique or through other colleagues in the civil society or that have reached us directly through our social media to ensure that that carrier knows that at a particular point in the EU or at a particular airport, there have been issues and they need to address those issues in line with the policy that is available. We are also talking with organizations such as Airlines UK, which is the trade body who has all the registered airlines in the UK. So they are the ones who would communicate with specific tools that the airlines employ. So the idea is that if the ETA response from the Home Office, as Monique said, it's broken, the e-visa is broken, or the digital status is not available, there is a series of steps that carriers can take, including checking passports, checking other forms of permission. So when we are talking with organizations such as Airlines UK, we want to make sure that the information they have is consistent with the information that the Home Office has, and that there are no discrepancies in the application of this information. And lastly, I would just want to address, because I've already seen a question in the Q&A about people who have settled or pre-settled status and they're traveling with the ETA. This is something that would not apply to someone who is resident in the UK and has other permission to travel to the UK. So that would be, as Monique said, e-visa or the EU settlement scheme digital status. So if you have pre-settled or settled status, you don't need this ETA because you already have a permission, and the carriers will have the ability to, when you are inputting your check-in details, your passport details, verify that permission to travel to the UK, which again, I'll reiterate, is very important that you keep your profile updated so you have that certainty that the carrier will receive the correct information from the Home Office. So I'm sorry if I wasn't as structured as Monique was. We have a series of tools and a series of communications that we are rolling out to the public and that we are rolling out to our member states. Again, I will pop some links in the chat or in the Q&A where you can find the information that we have, that's accurate, that it's updated, and that can serve as a basis for when you are traveling to the UK. If you are not extra certain what to do or whether certain travel requirements apply to you, you can check there and be basically reassured that as an EU settlement scheme national, for example, you do not need an ETA and you have the permission to travel to the UK. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. So as promised, I really will be handing over to Chris in a second. But before I do, I just want to summarize the 3 Million's position on all of this and what we're trying to do and how he can help us achieve change. So at the 3 Million, we've been very worried for quite a long time about all the impacts caused by the very rushed, in our view, historically speaking, rollout of digital-only immigration status. And that's now sort of colliding with the rollout of the ETA scheme. A lot of the problems we are seeing now were actually predicted in our detailed reports to the Independent Monitoring Authority. And what we want is a very serious discussion with the government to firstly make them accountable and to give compensation to those impacted. They've actually got there's a UKVI account terms and conditions page where they have specifically included an exclusion of liability for any losses occurring as a result of the use of a UKVI account, which we think is completely unacceptable. Secondly, we'd really like to have a proper independent review of the particular system of digital immigration status that the previous government has chosen and has kind of, foisted on people. And then thirdly, we'd like to discuss a better way forward, because we do think that there are some really, really good alternatives that can sit alongside the current system. We're not asking them to scrap everything, but we think people should be equipped with better status that's more under their control. But we need your help for this. We need evidence of how the current systems are failing and the impacts that this has on people. So please report your concerns to us through our Report It system on our website. We've recently launched an extra reporting form dedicated to travel problems, which is super simple and super short. Please fill it in. It'll only take a few minutes, and it's incredibly useful for us to hear your experiences, and whether that ranges from actually being denied boarding, or even if you just had difficult discussions and complexities at the airport, or even if you've just come across information that you think is wrong or misleading, we'd really, really like to hear about it. So please use that form. You can also file a complaint or log your story with the Independent Monitoring Authority. You can contact your MP, because this can be also a good way of advancing your own case while at the same time raising awareness with politicians about the difficulties people are facing. And finally, we need your help to make the case for change to government. And Kezia will talk about this in a little bit right at the end of the webinar. But now, as promised, I'm going to hand over to Chris to answer some of the questions that we sent in beforehand. So, Chris, I'm just going to start off with one of my own questions before I get to the list that was sent in. And that is about people who have settled status, but they got their settled status after having previously been refused settled status. So obviously in the early years, it was quite easy for someone to get refused because they didn't provide enough evidence, and the Home Office would just say, don't worry about it, just put in a new application. And we've seen lots of reports before ETA was introduced that these people would not be able to pass through the e-gates and would be directed to a border force officer. We're now seeing cases that these same people are actually not getting that automated OK to board message when trying to check in, and they get directed to a check-in desk. And I just wondered if you had any comment on that, or yeah, what's your advice there?
Thanks, Monique. I mean, and just by way of introduction for myself, thank you for inviting me to talk this evening. I'm really pleased to be able to join again, and I can't stress how much the two speakers who've come before me, Monique from the 3 Million and Christine from the EU delegation, have been working hard, so hard to make sort of make improvements to this system and make sure that it works for people in the way that it's intended to. So. In terms of the question of pre-settled status and settled status holders is a really simple one, actually, because that's a permission to live in the UK, and therefore it's a permission to travel to the UK. It doesn't get any more complicated than that in terms of what that permission is. And so in theory, it shouldn't be complicated. If your document that you're traveling on is linked to your UKVI account, your digital status, then the idea is that the Home Office gives the permission to board message to the carriers. And what's gone before is not relevant to that. If you've had 10 applications to the settlement scheme that were unfortunately refused, but your 11th application was successful and you have pre-settled or settled status, you have status and you have permission to travel here. So what's happened before should not impact on a carrier being told by the Home Office, oh, this is something you need to check, because your status is that of a permission to travel to the UK. I don't, my personal sort of understanding, I wouldn't know if that's what's causing the issue. But you're right to say that it has caused an issue with the e-gate, and that's to do with the fact a refusal is on record for someone. And that's using a Home Office database that is drawing potentially the same data that is going to a travel operator, a carrier. And so it seems logical that if that's reports that you're hearing, that could be what's happening. I'm here to tell you it shouldn't happen. And obviously, if that is something that's causing people problems in terms of checking in with their carriers, then this is the type of thing that must be reported to yourselves as the 3 million and to the Independent Monitoring Authority, who protects the rights of citizens and family members with settlement scheme status, because it really is something that would need to be looked into if that is causing an issue. Couldn't say definitively, but it sounds like that could be a cause, the previous refusal.
Great, thank you. And then also there's a question that should have hopefully a simple answer that I'm just going to squeeze in from Simona, who says, in the page of the share code, it's specifically written, show it to your employer, not airline or ferry company. Why would that be?
Yeah, the reason why that would be is because there's three types of share code. You have a selection to choose from. When you use the Home Office View and Prove service, they've designed it in a way that provides a share code for employers only. So the right to work check that employers must carry out, which I would think is the one that the question is relating to, because it's about show it to your employer. There's a share code for landlords. If you are renting accommodation in England, it doesn't apply to the other UK nations, but in England, landlords, agents on behalf of landlords may ask you for a share code if you're renting accommodation privately. So there's one that's just for landlords, and then there's a sort of share code other, which is the umbrella catch-all share code that is used for other types of proving your status, such as if you needed to show it to a bank, a university, for example, and in this context, a carrier, if they wanted to use the View and Prove service to check you have status, which gives you the permission to travel to the UK. That's the share code they would use. So it's the other one. It's not the employer, not the landlord. It's the other share code that you would generate for travel. It's valid for 90 days once you generate it. So if you're going on a short break, it's something you can do in the UK before you travel. Print off the share code itself. And you'd be able to, if needed. I mean, the idea is not that people are using share codes at check-in, but as you've already highlighted, it's a possible way of addressing the issue if a carrier is saying we're not getting digital confirmation from the Home Office. Do you have something else? The next place to go might be a share code, but it's the other type of share code that you need for travel purposes.
Thank you, Chris. In fact, I think you've half answered the next question, because we got a question sent in beforehand by Danielle, and she wrote to us, I've got settled status and would like to know which documents I need to present at the departure airport on my way back to the UK. Airline staff don't seem to be well informed or trained, and I want to make sure I have all the necessary documents. Some people mentioned share codes, and I was wondering how to get them. Do we need to get a new one each time we travel back to the UK? Do we have to wait until we're at the departure airport to get them?
Yes, I think so. Some of that will have been covered, but it's worth repeating, because we want to make sure we're clear on the best way to avoid issues with traveling. So as I say, it's of the three share code options that you can generate through the View and Prove service. We're talking about the other share code, not the employer one, not the landlord one, the other one. Once you've generated a share code, it's valid for 90 days. It can be used for those 90 days. It's not something that is a sort of one-time only usage. So you can, if you were traveling more than once in your 90 days, then you wouldn't need to generate one for each time. But if you're traveling once now and then 4 months down the line you're traveling again, you would want to generate a new share code to take with you. Do print it off, just because connectivity issues could occur. So it's worth doing in advance of travel. Obviously, if you don't and you forget and you're at the airport, if you've got connection, you can do it at the airport. It doesn't matter. Once you've got a share code, it's valid for use, for someone to check. So I'm sure some people will be generating them at the airport, and that shouldn't be an issue. Obviously, it does require, as again Monique has kind of highlighted, that the drawback is that it requires the carrier to engage with the share code if they're not getting the right permission. And just to reiterate, we wouldn't expect people, or we would hope that people are not routinely having to rely on share codes. That is not how the system is designed to work. It should be that the carrier and the home office between them can get the permission to travel sorted, and that you're not that there's not an obligation on you to provide share codes. But we are just saying we're in the early stages of electronic travel authorization for European nationals. So we are in a big phase of change, and that's why we would hope to expect the issues that we see today we wouldn't want to be talking about these. We don't want to be talking about them today, but we certainly don't want to be talking about them in 6 months, 12 months time. So what we're advising today is about sort of just having those safeguards in place, including the share codes. So hopefully that covers everything about the share code use.
Thank you. And I've got a question. I'm worried I'm going to mispronounce your name. I'm sorry. From Fian, who wrote to us, I've got a question for EU travellers from Vietnam to London. I hold a biometric passport with a link to my Home Office e-visa showing indefinite leave to remain. When leaving Vietnam at the passport control point before going through to the airport waiting lounge, the patrol officer told me that my passport isn't sufficient to show our right to entry to the UK. The patrol officer wanted a home address proof, plus the document from the Home Office to confirm our status in order to pass the border. Fortunately, on my mobile, I have proof of address with emails related to my bank statements, and I had the document from the Home Office to prove my indefinite leave to remain. But without these proofs, I wouldn't be back in the UK. Is this a normal procedure? In the future, do I need to have all these documents prepared before travelling outside Europe for the return to the UK, as well as a visa if required, which as a French national, I didn't need for Vietnam?
Yeah, and this is a really this question draws out a very sort of interesting and perhaps challenging aspect of the introduction of digital statuses and electronic travel authorization and so on. I would just sort of want to emphasize, I think that the question asks about patrol officer, and my view on this is we are talking about a Vietnamese patrol officer. We are not talking about a UK border officer that is based in Vietnam, because the UK doesn't base its border officers around there. They apply at the UK border. Obviously, in terms of some travel from Eurostar, you do encounter a UK border officer in France or Belgium, but certainly there is not a check about the UK border taking place in Vietnam. So what this sounds like this is to do with is about it's potentially exit controls on certain countries, because obviously sovereign countries are entitled to have exit controls. The UK, as you will experience, does not have exit controls when you leave the UK, so you don't get asked any questions in theory by UK border force on exit, but that's not necessarily the case for other countries. So the point to sort of emphasize what I'm trying to say is that the questions that occurred there were not checks that the Home Office in theory is not requiring these checks to be made, and so but it obviously creates a difficulty, because if there is a need from the perspective of the country you're exiting to show that you have a permission to go to the country that you're traveling to, then if they're not familiar with digital status, they won't have a connection to the Home Office database in the same way the airline does. then it could sort of cause you an issue. And we know that this is something the Home Office knows about, because they've got a gov.uk page that talks about making sure your e-visa is correct before you travel. And this explicitly says about checking the requirements of other countries when you're traveling, and what they require in terms of entry and exit. So there's sort of an acknowledgement that there could be questions about this, but also a passing of responsibility to you as the traveller, rather than the Home Office to sort of provide you with a solution. So again, I think if we were sort of trying to reduce the problems that people face in terms of this type of issue, again, it's not something we think should happen very often, if at all. But if you are in a country that is going to ask those questions, having printed documents of your immigration status, if it's pre-settled or settled status or another type of visa, or if you do get electronic travel authorization, printing off the confirmation of that, having something physically to show, it might help you with that. We don't have perfect solutions to these, because they're problems that are created by a digital system that the UK operates and may well understand, but other countries may not be there yet in terms of their understanding how the UK works. So I'm sorry not to give some of these, we don't have perfect solutions to these questions, so we're just giving the best advice we can. And of course, reporting, we're going to emphasize that reporting problems so that advocacy groups can sort of promote changes and improvements is so important here.
Thank you, Chris. So we had a question put into the Q&A from Teresa. If you're not able to travel back to the UK because the airline refuses, i.e. you can't get our status confirmed at the time, can we claim compensation against the airline for any financial loss if we can prove that we had the right to travel to the UK?
Yeah, it's a great question, again, which doesn't have a simple answer, because different compensation schemes apply to carriers depending on where they operate and depending on where, for example, where the journey may have originated to the UK from. So not every carrier is a UK or an EU based company, and so that can affect compensation. So we can't definitively say if you're wrongly refused boarding, you have a claim to compensation, even though that's probably what we would like to say. So the answer is, yeah, there is some compensation in place for wrongly being denied boarding. It's not just limited to this issue, but it would certainly cover this issue. So you need to look at the kind of schemes. There's the Civil Aviation Authority website has information about this. Carriers may have their own schemes in terms of claiming compensation. Obviously, it's really important that as much as you can, you understand the reason why you're being refused boarding. What is the information? It's unlikely you'll be given sort of necessarily a written explanation of why, but a clear understanding that you can challenge. For example, if a carrier is not receiving from the Home Office confirmation that you have pre-settled or settled status, for example, and that causes you to be denied boarding, then that is certainly something that we would say is clearly not your fault and should be something that could be taken up from a compensation perspective. It may be over time compensation schemes catch up with this digital approach, because I don't think that they're there yet. The ones that exist, and obviously carriers have an interest in protecting their finances by denying compensation if they can. So we wouldn't want to pretend it's straightforward, and it can be challenging. But having as much information about the situation and knowing why you're refused boarding is key to making a claim. So yeah, in some cases we would hope that well, in any case where something was incorrect, we would hope people can get compensation. But as I say, there's several variables that go into it, including where your flight originated from, if we're talking about a flight rather than travel that originated within the EU for like a Eurostar journey, etc.
Okay, great. So I'm going to turn to some questions now on dual nationals. And I'm first going to look at a set of questions where people are dual nationals, British and something else, and they have both passports. They have both a British passport and the passport of the other nationality. So Helga wrote to us saying, I'm a dual citizen, German and UK. I was born a German and then gained UK citizenship in 2018. I hold both passports. I note your comments that many airlines will only allow you to record in advance one passport for any return journey. So which passport should I use to book with an airline or tour operator or ferry company when traveling from the UK to the EU and back? Should I register my UK passport for both legs of the journey and then use my UK passport at UK Border Patrol as required when leaving the UK, and then present my German passport when arriving at the EU Border Control when entering the EU? And then on my return journey, I'll have registered my UK passport with the carrier and therefore shouldn't be asked for an ETA. And should I then use my German passport again at the EU Border Patrol as required when leaving the EU, and then present my UK passport when arriving at the UK Border Control when entering the UK? In this way, I will both leave and enter the UK on my UK passport, and I'll enter and leave the EU on my German passport. Please advise whether that's correct. And Jessica basically wrote to us almost exactly the same question and just wanted to make sure that this is the right way of doing things.
Yeah, I think that the fact that it took almost a minute to read the question shows you the difficulties and the complexities of dual nationality when you have a system imposed by the UK now and by the EU in the future that says if you're not from these countries, then you have to have these sort of extra permissions. So let's take. We always want to remove the travel carrier airline situation is different from the border. They're different decision makers. So the border issues are different from what the carriers and airlines and so on will expect. So if you are able, if you have two passports and when you book travel, if you are able to use both different passports for different journeys, that's great, because for the purposes of traveling back to the UK to avoid ETA, as the question rightly identified, you use a British passport because British nationals cannot be issued with an ETA and cannot be required to apply for one. So traveling to the UK, the carrier wants your British passport because they know that means you don't need an ETA. When the EU system of ETAs is in force, it's the same thing, but in reverse, because EU nationals entering the EU will not and cannot be given an ETIAS, but British nationals will be required for one. So in that situation, if you're traveling to Germany or any other EU country, you travel with your German passport, and if you can register that with the carrier, then that's what you want to do. So those are for the journeys. And as you again, you say in terms of the border, entering the UK, you enter on a British passport. That's your permission to enter to enter the UK is your British nationality. It's not any other type of permission. And equally, entering the EU is guaranteed by your EU nationality. So in terms of border entries, you use the respective passport at that point. In terms of exit, as I said, the UK wouldn't, as I understand it, require any particular check on a document and exiting the UK. It may be for EU countries that they do check, and some countries, the US is a good example of this, does require entry and exit. If you are a US national using your US passport. And so it's important to know the rules of the country that you are entering and exiting from. But from the UK purposes, you do not need to exit the UK on the same passport that you enter it. I believe that covers, I think, a extremely helpful FAQ on the issue of dual nationality, because it is a complex one. The link will be added very shortly, which is really, really important to read. And yeah, so this is why dual nationals are kind of asking these questions, because they're really good. They're really important questions to understand. And I suppose in time, again, what we would want to see from a carrier perspective is that carriers have an interest in making things as straightforward as possible for their customers for all sorts of reasons. And so when both the UK's ETA scheme, which is already running, and the EU's ETAs scheme is running, we would hope that carriers have a real interest in adapting their systems so that you can register each of your relevant passports for the part of the journey that needs the EU part for the EU leg of the journey, and the British passport for the UK return. Hopefully in time, for those carriers who don't have an option of that, it will come, because it makes sense to them to make your life and their lives easier, rather than having to do all these extra checks at the check-in when there's a pressure to get a flight off the ground.
Thank you. But so just to confirm, though, at the moment, because ETIAS isn't yet operational, people can kind of get away with just attaching their British passport both ways, because it doesn't, at the moment, you can travel to the EU with British passport and there's no problem, right? Because from a personal point of view, I'm a dual national, I'm British and Dutch. That's exactly what I do at the moment. I'm actually really dreading ETIAS coming into force, because sure, what you say, airlines will probably wise up to the fact and allow those two documents, but my two passports are in different names because my Dutch passport is in my maiden name, my British passport is in my married name, and I think I'm going to have to face the fact I won't be able to check in online in the future on at least one of the legs, because I'm going to have explaining to do and say it really is me. But anyway, so now we've got a question from Mike, who has done the opposite and has been booking with an EU passport for his round trip. And he says, I have an Italian and British passport now. What I've been doing so far is always check in with my Italian passport, and then I just I pull out my British passport when I arrive at the UK border. If the check-in in Italy queries my ETA, can I simply show them that I also have a British passport?
Yes. So the answer is yes, because obviously the British passport exempts you from ETA. We know that, and of all the kind of checks that the carriers bringing travelers to the UK would understand, we would hope, is that a British passport is clearly a document which exempts you from needing an ETA. So it would be possible to do that. So I guess what's changed in your situation since the introduction of ETA is, before, the carrier wouldn't have expressed too much interest in the fact if you were booking with your EU passport to travel to the UK, but once you arrive at the UK border, then you need to pull out your British passport to enter. Now you're having to show the carrier that same thing. So it's two occasions when you're going to have to prove your British nationality, and if you use your Italian passport to try and do an online check-in, that might not be possible now, because all the carrier is going to know about you is that you look to them like an Italian traveller, and therefore they need to get a permission from the Home Office, either an ETA or confirmation that you have pre-settled status, and they're not going to get that because your Italian passport won't have that information from the Home Office. It won't say, oh, this person's also a British national, because the Home Office system doesn't say that. So you may find that you're not going to be able to use online check-ins, and you'll have to go to the desk to show the carrier your British passport in that situation.
Okay, great. So then we have a question from Janine, who asks about dual nationals but who live abroad. and she asks, which passport should my parents use to book a flight ticket from Germany to the UK? They have dual citizenship, British and German, and they're originally a UK citizen, but they're resident in Germany. There's no option on the ETA form to apply as a German and then indicate that you also have a UK citizenship if you want to truthfully declare your other nationality. As far as we can see, the only option is to travel with both passports, but when do you use which? When you're booking your flight ticket, leaving Germany, entering the UK, leaving the UK, will the UK or German system show up that they are using different travel documents at different times?
Yeah, so the fact that your parents live in Germany and not in the UK doesn't change their position as far as ETA is concerned, because as we've said, ETA, you cannot apply for one as a British national. That's why the form doesn't let you apply for an ETA if you select that you have a British nationality or attempt to. So in terms of ETA, they do not need one. The fact that they live in Germany is not relevant to that. So again, a little bit like you will see the theme emerging is that the carrier will want to see the British passport either used on in an online check-in, or if at the check-in desk if it's not used in an online check-in, and then that covers them on entry to the UK as well. As far as, again, as I say, as far as leaving and entering countries on different documents, I can only really speak from the UK perspective, like definitively. And as I say, that if you're traveling to the UK as a British national, you'll be expected to enter on a British passport if you have one. In terms of exiting the UK, you're not required to exit on the same document you enter in. But as I say, I can't speak for the situation in other countries. But we will come back and we'll keep circling back with dual nationals to the EU schemes that are coming in, and the importance when that does happen, both the entry and exit system and ETAs, of entering the EU on an EU passport, because otherwise, from an EU perspective, if you enter on a British passport, it looks to EU border officers that you are then starting the clock on, in most cases, on a Schengen visit, which is 180 days, sorry, which is 90 days within 180 days as a maximum. So you look like you're someone who's subject to a limitation, but you're not, of course, because you have an EU nationality. So the theme that I'm sure people have seen, the theme we're emerging is we're talking about using different passports for different parts of the journey and the entry to the respective countries, and how important it is first of all, how important it is for you to know which one is used, but also hopefully to the decision makers and the commercial carriers, that it's important to make sure people have solutions that to the fact that these systems are now coming into force, with the UK one already being in force.
Great. Thank you. So I'm not sure whether you're going to have an answer to this next one, but Crystal asks, what will happen when dual citizenship kids travel with school? How can they approach that problem? The school and the company that the travel company they use won't be as accommodating, and airlines like Ryanair is really creating a nightmare for everyone. And I think Crystal's referring to like at the moment, Ryanair doesn't allow you to attach a different passport to each leg of the system. So what kind of problems do you foresee there?
Yeah, I mean, I think so obviously from the kind of legal perspective, which we've been talking about, the situation for dual citizen school kids is not different from an adult dual citizen. So the way that it should work for them is the same. We've already kind of covered about using EU and British passports for the right parts of those journeys. but obviously what we're talking about here is the fact that with school trips, it's organized by potentially a company, but by a school who are now having to navigate situations that they haven't had to in the past. And actually, this is something that's not just coming up now. It's actually something that was a Brexit sort of consequences has already been that school trips between the UK and the EU have been significantly impacted because obviously UK nationals are third country nationals for the EU, and likewise EU children who are coming to the UK for a school visit from the EU are considered they need immigration permission that they didn't need before when free movement applied. And so it's created all sorts of logistical difficulties already that has seen quite a significant drop. Certainly in EU school trips to the UK, there's been a very significant drop. One of the solutions that has been worked on, it took a couple of years, but French school kids, and that means not just French national school kids, but kids in school from France, have been able to kind of secure a more straightforward way of traveling to the UK in a not as straightforward as when free movement applied, but certain concessions was made by the UK government, by the Home Office, to allow school kids from the EU coming from France to use their national ID cards, for example. And so I guess what this shows is that where there is a will, there's a way to make appropriate concessions to I mean, I don't think anyone objects to school trips and the idea of a cultural exchange in that sense. So it would make sense for people to think about how to make this situation easier. But that's for policymakers. And what so I think they need to be looking closely at whether the introduction of ETA will further impact on EU children being able to come to the UK in the same way, or whether the schools and the sort of the trip operators just say, the paperwork is not worth it in this, because that seems like that would be a very negative outcome. So sorry, there's a bit of law in there, which is the children's position is no different from an adult's position, and then there's a bit of policy kind of hope that things might be looked at in time, and certain rules might be applied more flexibly.
Okay, great. I've got a few questions now, which are all to do about requirements for travelling to the EU. There's one from Lucy, which I think, to be honest, you've answered already, but Lucy asks, is it important for dual nationals to enter the EU on an EU passport in order to exercise their rights? Or can we use a British passport for ease if we're staying less than 90 days?
Yeah, so I think we've covered it. I mean, we would unequivocally say enter on your EU passport, because it's the correct document to enter on. Again, my area is not like laws in the EU in terms of entry and exit, so I don't know if there's any consequences for sort of not, or choosing not to enter on an EU passport if you possess one, but it's possible. But yeah, the very obvious one is that if you continue to have the British passport, and if you sort of breach the limit on the days, then you're going to find yourself in a really difficult and not very pleasant situation that you may be able to resolve by showing your EU passport, but we wouldn't want people to put themselves in that situation or be put in that situation in the first place. So yeah, unequivocally for us, use the EU passport for travel to, well, as you say, we for the purpose of the carrier at the UK end, you don't need to use your EU passport at the moment, but certainly the entry point you do. And once ETAs is live, you obviously will need to.
Okay. And then Julie asks, for dual nationals who are British and French with a valid British passport, but an expired French passport, but a valid French national ID, do you need to buy a visa to enter France from the UK?
No. Sorry, an expired, but a valid French national ID card. That is EU free movement rules cover entry to all EU countries with a national ID card from another EU country. I mean, you're going back to the country that you're national of, but yeah, you can enter any EU country with a valid EU national ID card. So, absolutely.
So I'm wondering also, as maybe the question is getting at, what if Julie didn't have a valid national ID card either, and so she was a dual citizen, but only had an in-date British passport and didn't have a French ID? Then what?
Yeah, that's if you flipped it on its head and applied the sort of British approach, if you said that person didn't have proof of their British nationality, then it becomes very challenging, because you wouldn't have proof that you don't need an ETA, because that's your British passport is your proof, and therefore you can't apply for an ETA because you can't have one, because you have to declare you're a dual national and a dual British national, and you can't have one, and law says you can't have one anyway as a British national. So it becomes, your legal position is very clear that you have the right to enter France or the EU, and that you have the right to enter the UK. So your legal position is clear, but your ability to do that it becomes very challenging, because you don't have what is the necessary proof. So again, if I look at it from the UK perspective, we sort of say, well, you have to get a British passport. There's something that you can get to put in your EU passport that says you're a British national if you don't want to get a British passport. So that's an alternative. But you have to have an official document that shows that you have British nationality for the purposes of ETA, or being exempt from ETA that carriers will require. And so I would imagine you're going to see the same problem once you have ETAs and the entry exit system in force, is that it's going to require EU nationals to have proof of their nationality in a certain form, and therefore people who don't are just there's no accommodation of them, and so and it will probably be quite unsympathetic and say, well, you need to get yourself the proof. Either it doesn't have to be a passport, it can be a national ID card, but it's got to be something. So that's the situation as I would see it.
So really, if it wasn't for Brexit, we'd all just be within the EU and therefore all within just ETIAS. If it wasn't for Brexit, it's Brexit that's making dual nationals have to own two passports now, right? And incur the expense of two passports. That's just what comes with the privilege of being a dual national, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, if we want to undo ETIAS and ETA for dual nationals, we rejoin the EU.
Great. Okay. So Brigitte asks, I'm a dual French UK citizen and I'm married. I'm living in the UK. So my questions are, I assume I am exempt as I use my French passport in the EU and my British passport in the UK. Is that correct? And I think she means exempt from ETA. And then she asks, how can my husband be exempt as legally he has the same rights as me, as my spouse? He's British. And I'm assuming now it must be exempt from ETIAS in the future, because being British, the ETA wouldn't apply for him.
Yeah. I mean, so obviously, if your spouse is British only, he certainly doesn't have exactly the same rights as you from an EU context, because he is a third country national. The fact that he is married to an EU national does put him in a sort of a superior position to someone who is British without any connection to an EU family member. But in the context of sort of entering the EU, he is a British national for that purpose, and so there's no visa requirement on British nationals, as Monique has covered. In terms of whether the difference that his situation as a British national married to an EU national compared to a British national who's not married to an EU national or not a family member of an EU national is the length of time he can spend in the EU. Because what free movement rules do, as you are a French EU national, is it allows you to have your family member to be with you if you are within the EU, and if you're covered by the free movement directive whilst you're there. So it's a complex situation, which we certainly wouldn't be able to go through in detail right now. But essentially, what it could mean for you is the normal rule that applies to British nationals, that you can't exceed 90 days within the Schengen zone, does not apply in every time. It doesn't apply for a family member who is British of an EU national. If their situation is covered by the free movement directive, they have the right to stay longer. So that's where his sort of position is more privileged. What the introduction of the EU systems, the entry-exit system and the ETAs system, needs to accommodate is that situation. Now, because it's not my area of expertise and because they're not in force yet, we'll have to wait and see how that situation is resolved. But there needs to be factored in, that there will be some British nationals present within the EU who are family members of EU nationals and have different rights to a normal British visitor who doesn't have any family connections.
Okay, thank you. So now I've got a couple of questions. Again, dual British and other nationals. Dual nationality was definitely the where we got the most questions, but this is from people who don't have a British passport, and I know we've touched on it already. But Veronica says, I am a naturalised British citizen and have a naturalisation certificate, but not a British passport, because these require applicants to send their EU passport away for a long period of time and thereby blocking them from travel. Naturalisation certificates are not electronically linked to an EU passport. I don't have settled status as I'm a British citizen. How will I be able to travel back to the UK? Sounds like I will be facing a lot of struggles entering the UK going forward. And somebody anonymously asked pretty much exactly the same question online earlier.
Yes, and I think, I mean, I'll go back to the answer a couple of questions ago, which is that there's probably not a great deal of sort of a sympathetic response from the authorities in terms of this a very, a kind of fairly reasonable point, which is that giving up your existing passport to obtain a British passport can create difficulties. But the position that you're going to encounter will be that the airline, I mean, in theory, the airline can do what they want. They don't have to sort of follow the Home Office approach to this. They could say, oh, if someone presents us a naturalization certificate that shows they're British, we can accept that they're British and we'll bring them to the UK. The reality is carriers are not going to do that. Because they know that the fines levied on them by the Home Office are significant, and so they are going to stick to the rules, which is if someone's a British national, they prove it via their passport, or as I say, in some cases you could get potentially confirmation in your EU passport of British nationality. But naturalization certificates are not going to be a document, in my view, that will get you through a carrier check to show that you don't need an ETA. So I think, unfortunately, the kind of final point was you'll face struggles without a British passport. Yes, that is the reality. Yeah.
Yes, that's clear, even if it's depressing. Okay, and then we had a question from Jane, who says, I've lived, studied, worked in the UK for 45 plus years. I recently found out in 2010 that I perhaps may be British, maybe retrospectively due to a change in the law and the fact that my mother was British. However, I've had health issues, and so it's prevented me from tackling what appeared to be a mountain of stressful paperwork. So as a result, Jane, I emailed a little bit with her. She's French with indefinite leave to remain, but in an old format, not in the form of an e-visa, granted in the mid-80s. And so it's an old document, a stamp in an old passport. And so what is her situation regarding ETAs? Does she have to apply for an ETA in order to be allowed to go back home to the UK?
Yeah. So I think one thing to be clear on is if someone's a British national, then they do not hold an immigration status. They don't hold indefinite leave. They don't hold settled status. They don't hold pre-settled status. They may have done, but once someone is British, that is the end of any immigration permission that they previously held. So it's all about British passport and relying on that going forwards. If I'm honest, when I hear this, it's very unusual for British nationality law to make someone British if they weren't born British. There are some limited situations, but so it would. I think it's unlikely this person is a British national, but obviously that's subject to someone assessing everything about their situation. They may have a claim to British nationality based on their mother. That's a different thing, because you can obviously become British at a point in your life if you qualify, but it may be that they're not British from birth. If they've got the indefinite leave to remain stamp that was issued in the 80s, then that would still be valid as an immigration permission as long as they haven't spent too long outside the UK, because there are limits on how long you can spend outside the UK if you have indefinite leave to remain. But if we assume that the indefinite leave to remain stamp is still valid, from the purposes of electronic travel authorization, then you are absolutely still entitled to rely on that stamp that's in your passport, as it is your immigration permission. That is your permission to return to the UK. You do not need an ETA. You'll need to show it to the airline, of course, because it's not a digital status. So the check that the carrier makes with the Home Office isn't going to return a positive permission for you to travel, because your status isn't known to the Home Office digital system in that way. So you will always be presenting it to the airline. And so what we generally will say to people as advice, in terms of if you have these kind of older types of immigration status, like the indefinite leave to remain, like a stamp, maybe the Home Office gave you a letter, which they did to some people back in the day. Maybe they gave you some form of other document which says, but it's a physical document. We feel that it's important to get a digital status, and there are different ways of potentially showing or getting your existing indefinite leave to remain moved to a digital status, depending on your circumstances. For EU nationals, we would encourage them to use the EU settlement scheme to get their indefinite leave to remain converted into settled status, which is possible. There are other routes if you're not an EU national to get a digital proof of your indefinite leave to remain. But the reason why we feel this is so crucial is because this whole webinar this evening has been about the digital nature of this of immigration control, the move away from physical documents, and of course the problems that we see with that. But we're not going to retreat. We might get improvements, but we're very unlikely to move back from digital status. And so people having a digital status is something that should help them just go about their everyday life, have the rights that they're entitled to. And then we would hope that there are improvements that come along with that we've already heard about and we'll hear about again, I'm sure. So my view on this situation is that your indefinite leave stamp is what's used to show that you don't need to get an ETA. You will be showing that to the carrier, but you probably would be able to convert that into a digital status, potentially through the EU settlement scheme. You may also have a claim to British nationality, which you could pursue if you wanted. But yeah, so that's sort of how I would see that situation.
Thank you. I just wanted to add something that I suddenly thought of, because we didn't get any questions on this, but there's a cohort who have the right to travel to the UK, and it's some, not everyone, but some people who've got a certificate of application, and it's only people who've got a certificate of application for the EU settlement scheme who were living here before the end of 2020 and who've maintained continuous residence. And if you're not in that category, it's very risky to travel with a certificate of application. But that cohort is allowed to enter, but we don't see how they get past the barrier of ETAs. And so I'm not going to ask a question about that, but I just wanted to highlight that we've recently written to the Home Office about it, and hopefully Kezia can paste the link in the chat to the letter, and we're still waiting for a response to that. So I've now just got one more question from Massimo. And this is about Northern Ireland, that very tricky topic when it comes to ETAs. And he writes, both my wife and I live in Northern Ireland and have been granted settled status. We're often asked by friends and family travelling to Northern Ireland via Dublin whether they should be requiring an ETA despite there not being border checks between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Understandably, we answer yes, and absolutely yes, if they intend to travel on to the rest of the UK. My question is if there's any clarity on cross-border requirements of an ETA, and more importantly, who is supposed to enforce it? Is it car hire companies, bus drivers, agency, or organising the trip? And what if they were travelling by their own means?
Yeah, it's a nice
thorny one.
If we don't get any more questions, it is squeezed in today. This will be a very good one, interesting one to finish on. Yeah, so obviously, so the broad answer, there are special arrangements in place for travel to the UK from the Republic of Ireland. This means anywhere in the UK. So Northern Ireland is not treated any differently in the sense of ETA being required to enter. But if you're coming from if you're coming from the Republic of Ireland to the UK, including crossing into Northern Ireland, you may be exempt from the need to have an ETA. If you are Irish citizen, you're exempt, full stop. You never need an ETA because you have rights to enter the UK under the Common Travel Area arrangement. So Irish citizens do not need an ETA. If you are an EU citizen who lives in Ireland, then you do not need an ETA to enter any part of the UK if you're coming from the Republic of Ireland. So if you're traveling from Dublin to London and you are a Bulgarian national, but your residence is in Ireland, then you do not need an ETA. Look up the gov.uk, the webpage on ETA and residence of Ireland, because you may be required proof that shows you live in Ireland to show you're exempt. But anyone else, if you're going into the UK, if you're traveling into Dublin for a visit and you want to go to Belfast as part of that trip, then you need an ETA. If you're visiting the Republic and then you're planning to visit Northern Ireland or anywhere else in the UK, you need to have an ETA. So the Massimo has given his family absolutely the correct advice here. In terms of enforcement, so there is no border, there is no hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So someone would not be, who didn't have an ETA, who required one to visit the UK, is unlikely to be stopped. But that doesn't change the fact that they need an ETA. And if for some reason they have an immigration encounter at some other point, then the fact that they don't have an ETA when they need one is a problem for them. In terms of sort of enforcing it from a carrier perspective, then this applies. Carrier's liability applies to like entities who bring people to the UK. There's a specific definition, but the point is, if you are part of an organized trip, like by a bus company, for example, they may well be a carrier for the purposes of ETA, and they would potentially face a fine if they didn't do the right checks and someone entered or tried to enter who didn't need an ETA. So in principle, you have the same issue. You have the carrier issue, which is about proving you have the permission to travel to the UK, and you have a border issue. Even though you're not crossing a border, a hard border, you're entering the UK without a correct permission. And if you are established that that's your situation by immigration officer, then you would face the consequences of that. So yeah, it's really confusing. It's not helpful, but in the majority of scenarios, visiting the UK, if you've entered, even if you've travelled into Dublin first, but onward visiting to the UK, ETA will be necessary. Obviously, the person answering this question had settled status, so we know they're exempt.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thank you to everyone who sent in questions beforehand. I'm sorry we didn't get to very many of the questions that were posted live, but we will answer them in writing afterwards, and it might take a little while, but we will send you a document at some point. And with that, I just want to now say thank you to Chris and to hand over to Kezia Tobin, our Head of Policy and Advocacy, who's going to share some more stuff about what the 3 Million's doing.
Thanks, Monique, and thanks so much, Chris, again, for your really clear explanations of all these issues, which, as we can see, are incredibly complicated and continue to make life quite difficult for people as digital status has been rolled out. As you might know, at the 3 Million, we've been very focused on trying to get the government to fix digital immigration status, both, as Monique said earlier, by launching a full independent review of the system as it is at the moment, and also to look at alternatives. But we really need your support for that. And there's an opportunity coming up on the 19th of May that we want to talk to you about, because we see it as a chance for you and for us to have our voices heard on this issue. What's happening on that day is the EU-UK summit, and it's happening here in London, and the Prime Minister will be meeting with several high-ranking EU officials. And so it's your chance, or our chance, to make sure that citizens' rights are at the heart of that conversation. So what we're doing is we're organising a mass lobby on that day in Parliament, and it will be a chance for people to speak to their MPs to try and ensure that MPs are aware of the issues and hear the stories that you all have to share about the way that you're impacted by these issues. And so we'd really like to invite you all to come and join us on that day. In preparation for it, we're also organising a series of workshops, briefing workshops. The first one is actually next week in London on the 7th of May. And I'm just going to post details to that here in the chat. And that is the first link that I've posted there. It will be an opportunity for you to meet other people who are affected by these issues, to figure out what arguments and discussion points would work with MPs, work on campaign skills, and also explore some of the powerful personal stories of the way that these issues impact on people's lives. But of course, we're conscious that you're not all based in London. So those of you that are not able to join us could still join us for some online briefings. We've got one also on the 7th of May and another one on the 12th of May as well. So that's on digital status, but not only digital status, because as we know, status is insecure in other ways for holders of EUSS pre-settled status as well. And that's something that we also want to be talking about with MPs at this mass lobby, and another mass lobby in June as well, especially for people who think that they might have broken the continuity of their residence by having been outside the UK for too long. And on that, we've got a peer support group that we've set up recently, which is for people who are affected by that, who are at risk of having their status potentially curtailed because of excessive absences, or who think they might be. And it's a chance to meet other people who are in that situation, share your stories, build solidarity, and also to look at safe ways of sharing our concerns and your concerns about that with decision makers. So you can find out more information on the second link there in the chat about that. So please do join us. We hope you found this evening's webinar helpful, and we hope that you will click on the third link there to support the 3 million, but we also hope to see you at one of the events that are coming up over the next few weeks. Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks so much again to Chris. Bye.